I'm not here to argue that whatsoever. They've got a tough job, a job that most of us in this room wouldn't want to do. They've got a tough job, and I don't take anything away from them whatsoever. But I think what they have is probably where it should end.
Have you had a chance to talk to the leadership in the House or the Senate about stopping some of these unfunded mandates?
I've been doing that for the last 15 minutes. So.
Take this resolution door to door to lawmakers. Said that last week. Are you still going to do that?
Absolutely. Nope. You know what? How do you know if it does any good? I don't know. Time will tell, Jim. Yeah. I'll stay to the south end of the building, though.
What are your hopes in terms of the IML's legislation? What's the most important thing that they can do?
All of them are. If you look in there, you're going to find the 9 points that are being addressed and the proposed legislation itself. And perhaps Joe, Roger, one of you guys want to? Let me. There's Joe McCoy with the Illinois Municipal League, who is probably drafted. Joe, you're the one that's drafted it. So why don't you talk about some?
Thanks, Mayor. This is a little impromptu, so I apologize for that. But I wanted to go over some of the 9 points that we have. As we came up with these 9 points, we had really 2 considerations. What could we do that would put us in a best position to begin addressing the problem that we have with the police and fire pension funds with regard to funding? Number 2, the all-important consideration, which is the political consideration, what becomes palatable to the members of the General Assembly and perhaps the fire and police unions themselves. So what we did is we put together a committee made up of municipal managers, and we came up with 9 points that we think are very common sense reforms. I'll run through them very quickly. The first one is an exemption from property tax caps for non-home rule municipalities. Those are the municipalities that have fewer than 25,000 citizens and have not adopted home rule through referendum. The General Assembly has stated that, according to statute, that the pensions are going to be primarily funded through the property tax levy, but then years later, in the early to mid-90s, they imposed these tax caps, capping the revenue source that they themselves had set aside for these municipalities. So we believe that non-home rule municipal tax cap needs to be lifted. The second point is we think that there's a tremendous lack of knowledge among the public of what's going on with these pension funds. We found something very interesting. Out of the 17 public pension funds in Illinois, 15 of them have pretty extensive studies written about them, 2 don't. And the 2 that don't are the downstate police and the downstate fire funds. They're also unique in that they have, as the mayor mentioned, there are hundreds of these individual funds. So we think that 2 things need to be done in regard to letting people know what's going on there. We published our own study back in February of 2007 to try to illustrate what these benefits were. We think that going forward, though, a state entity should be publishing that study because they do the other pension systems as well, and that adds some credibility to it. And we also think that whatever the fiscal situation, for example, in Springfield, whatever that might be, we think that the local newspapers should run, paid for by the pension funds themselves, should run a description of the financial situation of each of those pension funds so the public can know. I mean, municipalities have to publish things all the time. Pension funds are public bodies. They should have to publish this information too. And we need to bring the public into this to know exactly what these are costing. Another item that we're concerned about is the police and fire pension funds don't have any strong anti-fraud language. We believe that the same legislation, anti-fraud legislation that governs firefighters and police officers when they're making workers' comp claims should also be included within the downstate police and fire pension funds. It's something they should be familiar with. We're just moving it from the workers' comp statute over to the police and fire pension funds. We also think that there needs to be disclosure in some ethics reform. We need to know, a lot of times these local funds end up hiring professional consultation. We think that it's important that whoever they're hiring has to disclose all of their personal relationships, and we also think that there needs to be some ethics reform to make sure that whoever is being hired isn't also providing some sort of financial benefit to one of the individual trustees of the pension board. We think that's common sense. Those 2 provisions were actually in legislation that received 99 votes in the House last year. It wasn't considered in the Senate, so those 2 provisions are something that the House has overwhelmingly supported in the past. I had already mentioned the pension study that we want them to do, but along those same lines, part of the problem that we have when we consider legislation in the building, when we take a look at it, and we have the committee hearings where they consider the legislation, what happens is that there's a fiscal note produced by the Commission on Governmental Forecasting and Accountability. That fiscal note comes up with an estimated statewide cost of each of these pension benefits. The problem is the fiscal note creates kind of a false impression of what's going on in the state, because we have these hundreds of individual pension funds, but what the fiscal note does is it takes all the funds, so we have in excess of 500 funds, consolidates them together in a manner that they don't really exist, merges the numbers, and comes out with a statewide blended average. That statewide blended average does not tell each municipality what the cost impact might be to that municipality. For example, we could get a pension bill that's estimated costing 3% of payroll. It could cost 1% of payroll for some municipalities. It could be 15% for other municipalities. Much of that just depends on the demographics within each of these cities. So we would propose that before the General Assembly considers legislation that's going to increase pension benefits, that they should produce somewhere between 25 and 50 studies on how the legislation is going to impact those municipalities. We think that's just a common sense measure. We also think that there needs to be additional state regulation over what these funds are actually doing and how they operate, primarily in the form of audits. We found something very interesting when we spoke with members of the Public Pension Division of the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. What we found was that they only get out to perform audits on these funds once every 10 years. They're not complete audits. They're partial audits, and they only go back 2 years. So you can have they're doing a partial audit, and you can have an 8-year span where these funds aren't even being audited at all. So nobody really knows exactly what's going on with regard to the investments, and this gets back into the ethics reform and the disclosure as well. But it's very important that we have tighter regulation of these pension funds in order to preserve the monies that already exist in those funds, in order to pay the benefits that have been promised to police officers and firefighters. We think that's a very important thing to do.